Didn't think you had drug runners in your own neighborhood.
No.
After 400 pounds of cocaine were uncovered in a quiet New York neighborhood, the story exploded, but not the way anyone expected. Reports say the U.S. Army got involved, and what followed wasn't a raid, it was a massacre. In this video, I'll show you how it's being covered up. The massacre in New York. It started like a scene ripped from a Hollywood thriller, but this wasn't a movie. This was New York City, the financial capital of the world, suddenly turned into a battlefield. Federal agents swarmed a quiet block in Queens, and what they uncovered inside a modest apartment was staggering. 400 pounds of cocaine stacked like bricks of cash, ready to saturate the streets with poison.
Does it surprise you that that kind of thing's going on in a neighborhood like this?
To the volume and the extent that it was, yes.
Didn't think you had drug runners in your own neighborhood.
No.
The media needed hours to even calculate the street value before releasing the number. By then, the cartel's name was already echoing across every newsroom in America, the Cali Cartel. But here's the shocking twist. What unfolded in that apartment decades ago wasn't just history. It was the blueprint, the very same playbook Mexican cartels used to burrow into New York's infrastructure, embedding themselves so deeply that today, DEA officials openly admit the city is a hub for cartel pipelines. And when the U.S. Army decided to finally strike back, targeting what officials described as a narco-terrorist network operating openly on American soil, the operation spiraled into what insiders now call a massacre. This is the story of how one secret military strike in New York revealed not only the depth of cartel infiltration, but also how a war that was supposed to stay south of the border has arrived in America's biggest city. And trust me, the most shocking part is still to come. To understand the bloodbath that followed, you have to see the scale of the enemy. These weren't corner hustlers. They weren't even just cartel couriers. They were embedded in the very arteries of New York's infrastructure. Just last year, federal investigators exposed a fentanyl mill in the Bronx, operating out of an apartment where a 42-year-old trafficker carried 40 pounds of fentanyl on the subway, right past unsuspecting commuters. Special Agent Frank Tarantino didn't mince words when he went on CBS 2.
The cartels are most definitely here in New York.
That single bust equated to over 1 million lethal doses of fentanyl. Think about that. 1 million overdoses, hidden in luggage, moving through a city where millions ride the subway every day. And the kicker, that case was less than a mile away from a daycare where a 1-year-old boy died after being exposed to fentanyl stashed under the floorboards. The cartels weren't hiding in the shadows anymore. They were walking right alongside ordinary New Yorkers, moving their poison with a kind of arrogance that said, "What are you going to do about it?" That arrogance was the spark, because when President Trump declared cartels foreign terrorist organizations, it gave Washington the legal green light to deploy the U.S. military, not just the DEA, not just local police, but full-on Pentagon resources. And in August 2025, the gloves officially came off. According to a bombshell DEA release, an MQ-9 drone flew 600 miles into Mexico hunting cartel kingpins, marking the beginning of Project Portero, the flagship operation to dismantle cartel gatekeepers. The message was clear. The era of negotiations was over. This was war. And New York, the so-called destination city for cartel shipments, was ground zero. But here's where the story takes its dark turn. The Pentagon believed it was launching a precision strike, surgical, targeted, swift. What they didn't anticipate was the hornet's nest they were kicking open. Because behind those pipelines, behind those hidden fentanyl mills, behind those luxury apartments stuffed with cocaine, were networks run directly by the Sinaloa cartel, the same empire once led by El Chapo and Ismael El Mayo Zambada. And let's be clear, El Mayo wasn't just another narco. He admitted to trafficking 1.5 million kilos of cocaine into the United States, making billions in the process, and keeping his empire alive with violence, bribery, and murder. When the army hit what they thought was just a supply pipeline, they were actually cutting into the veins of an empire, and the cartel responded in kind, fast, bloody, and without mercy. What unfolded in New York shocked even hardened agents. Entire neighborhoods became lockdown zones overnight. Military convoys patrolled streets usually reserved for food trucks and yellow cabs, and when the shooting started, it wasn't some quick raid, it was a massacre. Cartel gunmen unleashed military-grade firepower, weapons that Marco Rubio himself once warned were the kind terrorists in some cases armies have. The firefights weren't happening in Sinaloa or Michoacan or along some dusty border road. They were happening in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, in Queens, right in the heart of the city that never sleeps. And here's the part that should chill every viewer. The army didn't have the upper hand at first. For all the tech, drones, and special forces, U.S. troops found themselves facing narco soldiers who fought like trained insurgents. Because by now, cartels weren't just smuggling drugs. They were running like paramilitary groups with layers of surveillance, counter counterintelligence, and heavy weaponry, all financed by billions in American drug money. The very infrastructure that kept Wall Street humming was now hiding cartel pipelines. Cargo ships docking at U.S. ports carried not just electronics and clothes, but millions in hidden cocaine shipments, a method pioneered by the Cali cartel decades ago. DMV employees were once caught issuing fake plates to cartel couriers, and now cartel accountants sat in Manhattan high-rises, laundering billions through fake shell companies. This wasn't infiltration, it was occupation. And the most shocking revelation, the massacre in New York wasn't an accident. According to insiders, U.S. intelligence knew the risk. They knew the cartels had militarized their New York operations, but after years of fentanyl overdoses, cartel kidnappings, and narco soldiers mocking America from across the border, Washington made a decision. Better to unleash the army and risk a bloodbath than allow cartels to keep poisoning Americans unchecked. The result? New York bled, soldiers bled, civilians bled, and yet officials insist it was necessary. Necessary to show the cartels that America wasn't afraid to bring the fight to its own backyard. Necessary to prove that when it comes to national security, there are no red lines, even if it means turning U.S. streets into a war zone. Back in the 1980s, it was Don Chepe, Jose Santa Cruz Londono, who transformed New York into the Cali cartel's personal ATM. His network was so precise, so disciplined, that it pumped over $7 billion a year into cartel coffers. While Pablo Escobar used bombs and assassinations in Miami, Cali used accountants and bribes in Manhattan. The result? A cartel empire operating under everyone's nose, laundering billions through the same financial institutions that moved Wall Street's money. Fast forward 40 years, and history wasn't just repeating itself, it was amplifying. Instead of cocaine hidden in cargo ships, New Yorkers were now riding the subway alongside couriers, hauling fentanyl strong enough to wipe out entire boroughs. Instead of small stash houses, cartel fentanyl mills were being built just steps away from daycare, centers where toddlers played. Instead of whispers about Colombian capos, federal prosecutors were dragging El Mayo, one of the founders of the Sinaloa cartel, into a New York courtroom to face charges for shipping over 1 million kilos of cocaine into the United States. But if anyone thought the strike would be clean and surgical, they were dead wrong. The war that Washington thought it could contain had just gone public. And here's the chilling reality. This wasn't just a fight for New York. This was a global message. Cartels across Mexico, Colombia, and Venezuela were watching closely. In Sinaloa, a cartel producer openly told reporters,
Claro, en baja escala, ¿entiendes? Pero no igual como antes, pero se sigue haciendo.
I mean, according to the Trump administration, you are a terrorist. I mean, the cartels have been labeled a foreign terrorist organization. What do you make of that?
Está fea la situación, ¿verdad? Está fea la situación, pero pues todos nos tenemos que comer.
Translation? Even with the army kicking in doors, the cartels weren't backing down. They were adapting.
What's your message to Donald Trump, if he's watching this?
Mi respeto, él tiene que según él, buscar lo mejor para los suyos. Pero el detalle que ya están los consumidores, ¿no? Si no hubiera consumidores, pues uno le parara.
And that's the part that should terrify every American watching this. The massacre in New York wasn't the end of the pipeline war, it was the beginning. Because once the US crossed that red line, sending troops into its own cities to strike cartel networks, there was no going back. Let's be clear, this wasn't just about drugs anymore. This was about sovereignty, about whether the US government could maintain control of its own streets in the face of an enemy fueled by billions of American dollars. As one analyst put it, cartels have become insurgents, and New York is their battlefield. So where does that leave us? With a city scarred, a military bruised, and a cartel emboldened. And the question hanging over Washington is this: do you double down, risk turning more American cities into combat zones, or do you pull back and admit that the cartels have already entrenched themselves so deeply they're practically untouchable? Either way, the massacre in New York proved one thing beyond any doubt. The war on cartels is no longer down there, it's here. And the most shocking part, the army hasn't even revealed what they found inside that pipeline safe house, the evidence that could expose how far cartel tentacles have wrapped around America's institutions. But that's coming, and when it does, it will change everything. The cartel's counterstrike. When the dust finally settled in New York, the army claimed victory. But what they discovered inside that Queens safe house was more alarming than the firefight itself. Forget the bricks of cocaine or bundles of fentanyl, that was expected. What caught officials off guard were the documents, hard drives, and encrypted devices stacked in a back room. These weren't just logistics notes, they were blueprints. Blueprints for a network so vast it connected stash houses in the Bronx to financial fronts in Manhattan, narco subs docked in Florida, and corrupt port officials in Mexico. Investigators later admitted, off the record, that they hadn't anticipated the cartel's New York pipeline being run with the sophistication of a multinational corporation. This wasn't street-level dealing. This was a shadow economy, worth billions, operating right under America's nose. Here's where it gets even darker. The evidence pointed not only to Sinaloa, but to CJ Yang, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, and even remnants of the Cali cartel's old financial web. The Army strike had essentially cut into a cartel consortium, a Frankenstein network pooling resources to dominate the U.S. Northeast drug market. The files revealed joint operations across states, coordinated shipments up the I-95 corridor, and even connections to fentanyl labs in Sinaloa, where cartel chemists boasted about producing synthetics capable of generating millions of doses in weeks. More chilling still, there were traces of communications with foreign actors. Intelligence hinted at Venezuelan cartel of the Suns figures and whispers of Russian laundering intermediaries. The safe house didn't just hide drugs, it hid the cartel's American playbook. That revelation shifted Washington's calculus. It wasn't just about seizing fentanyl or arresting lieutenants anymore. It was about dismantling a narco-terrorist infrastructure that had penetrated everything from daycare centers in the Bronx to Wall Street boardrooms. And so, the Pentagon expanded the mission. Enter Project Portero, the DEA's new flagship operation. The plan? Target cartel gatekeepers, the men who directed the flow of drugs into the U.S. and money back to Mexico. These weren't low-level street soldiers. They were the logistical masterminds, the equivalent of military generals. Take them out, the thinking went, and you collapse the system. And so, joint task forces were assembled. U.S. Special Forces, DEA tactical units, and Mexican elite troops like the Fuerzas Especiales, FES, and Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, GAFES. Training began at secret intelligence hubs along the border, but while the U.S. and Mexico were gearing up for joint strikes, the cartels were already plotting their revenge. The massacre in New York wasn't a deterrent, it was a propaganda goldmine. Cartel media channels blasted clips of dead soldiers and burning Humvees, mocking Washington's failed invasion. Memes compared the Army's urban firefights to Black Hawk Down, branding the U.S. as clumsy occupiers in their own city. But behind the mockery, the cartels went on the offensive. Within weeks of the New York strike, explosions rocked Culiacan, where cartel forces attacked Mexican soldiers tasked with eradicating opium fields. In Michoacan, drones were rigged with explosives and used to strike police convoys. And in New York itself, whispers spread that cartel operatives were plotting retaliatory hits on law enforcement families. This wasn't random chaos, it was coordinated. Intelligence analysts warned that the cartels had adopted insurgent tactics, studying U.S. military doctrine and flipping it against American forces. The human cost was staggering. In Sinaloa alone, over 1,200 people were killed in a year as factions of the cartel tore each other apart in the wake of Washington's escalation. Families disappeared overnight. Posters of missing loved ones lined city walls. Reporters who dared to cover the violence were silenced. Some vanished, others killed. One haunting case was Vivian Espuro, a young woman whose disappearance became a symbol of the cartel's impunity. Her family begged for answers, only to later confirm the worst. Vivian's body had been found dumped like trash. Her sister, through tears, said,
Her body has just been found. I'm so sorry for your loss, I really am. Are you able to tell me a little bit about your sister?
Fue una niña feliz, tuvo todo lo que siempre quiso, fue muy amada. Le gustan mucho los gatos.
For Washington, Vivian's death wasn't just another tragedy. It was political ammunition, proof that cartels weren't just drug dealers, they were terrorists, leaving grieving families and burned cities in their wake. But not everyone agreed with the military escalation. Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, repeated her mantra, hugs, not bullets. Social programs, not drone strikes, she argued, would dismantle cartel power. Critics scoffed. One U.S. commentator mocked, cartels hug you with 15 rolls of duct tape and dump you in a lake. The divide between Washington and Mexico City grew sharper. While U.S. drones prowled the skies, Mexican officials worried about sovereignty. Every strike risked inflaming nationalism and accusations that Mexico was bowing to American military dominance. But behind closed doors, even Sheinbaum's allies admitted the violence was spiraling out of control. And then came the wild card, El Mayo's guilty plea in New York. One of the founding fathers of the Sinaloa cartel, a man who had trafficked cocaine for decades, finally admitted guilt in a U.S. courtroom. Prosecutors boasted about seizing $15 billion in assets. They promised he'd spend the rest of his life in prison. But to the cartels, El Mayo's fall wasn't a defeat, it was a rallying cry. Social media lit up with narco ballads celebrating his sacrifice. Memes painted him as a martyr betrayed by his own partners. And in Sinaloa, whispers spread that his sons and lieutenants were plotting revenge, determined to prove that the cartel's leadership would not be broken by one guilty plea. In other words, the U.S. thought it had scored a victory. Instead, it had poured gasoline on the fire, and while the cartels fought back, they were also evolving. Intelligence from the New York raid suggested they were experimenting with new smuggling technologies, narco subs guided by stealth drones across the Gulf, AI-encrypted communications that evaded U.S. surveillance, and even biochemical additives designed to stretch fentanyl supplies further, creating more product at lower cost. One DEA analyst admitted bluntly, "We're not fighting a cartel anymore. We're fighting a hybrid terror organization with corporate strategy and military firepower." So where did this leave New York? Scarred, on edge, and bracing for more. National Guard patrols became a semi-permanent fixture in certain neighborhoods. Subway riders whispered about who might be carrying fentanyl next to them. Parents double-checked their children's daycare centers, terrified another Divino Niño tragedy would strike. But the greatest fear wasn't another raid, it was another massacre. Because intelligence suggested the cartels weren't done with New York. They were preparing a counterstrike, targeting the very institutions America relies on most: financial hubs, transit systems, even hospitals. And here's the part no one in Washington wanted to admit. If that counterstrike came, the army might not be able to stop it in time. That's the story the government doesn't want you to hear. The New York Massacre wasn't an isolated battle. It was the opening salvo of a war that now stretches from the streets of Queens to the poppy fields of Sinaloa, from Venezuelan ports to Colombian jungles. And the most disturbing revelation from that safehouse evidence? A list of American politicians, bankers, and even local police officers suspected of being on the cartel payroll. That list hasn't been released publicly, not yet, but insiders say when it is, the fallout will make the New York Massacre look like a warm-up act. Because this war isn't just about cartels versus soldiers, it's about cartels versus America's very institutions. And the cartel's message is clear: if you come for us in Mexico, we'll bleed you in New York. America's new narco war. By the time Washington declared the New York operation a success, the truth had already leaked. Success? Tell that to the families burying loved ones after crossfire turned neighborhoods into free-fire zones. Tell that to the civilians who watched armored vehicles roll past their windows like they were living in Baghdad. And tell that to the soldiers whose bodies were flown home under flag-draped coffins. The army could spin the headlines, but the cartels had won the narrative war. Social media was flooded with videos painting the massacre as proof that America's military was unprepared for urban combat on its own soil. TikTok montages mocked U.S. troops as foreign invaders in New York. Telegram channels shared instructions on how to ambush convoys, recycling battlefield lessons from Syria and Iraq for use against soldiers patrolling Queens. The cartels didn't just survive the army strike, they weaponized it. And then came the counter-strike. It didn't happen in Mexico. It didn't even happen at the border. It happened in New York's financial heart, Wall Street. According to leaked FBI memos, cartel-linked hackers infiltrated a mid-level trading firm suspected of laundering narco money. Within hours, stock trades went haywire, millions vanished, triggering ripple effects that spooked markets worldwide. To the public, it was reported as a cybersecurity incident. To insiders, it was something far worse: the first narco cyber attack on U.S. soil, retaliation for the massacre. And while Washington scrambled to contain the damage, cartel operatives unleashed their most brazen strike yet. A fentanyl stash, deliberately placed in a Manhattan public school's basement, was tipped off to authorities by an anonymous call. When hazmat teams stormed in, they found enough fentanyl to kill the entire student body 10 times over. The message couldn't have been clearer: you kill us in the streets, we'll remind you how easily we can kill your children. The political firestorm was immediate. President Trump's administration defended the strikes, citing national security and the terrorist designation of cartels. But opposition leaders blasted the White House, accusing it of turning New York into a battlefield without a plan for civilian safety. One senator snarled, "This isn't counter-terrorism, this is reckless militarization." Meanwhile, Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum doubled down on her hugs not bullets stance, publicly condemning U.S. military actions even as her own army was dragged deeper into joint operations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. While Mexico claimed sovereignty, U.S. drones were already flying 600 miles into its territory hunting kingpins. Internationally, the fallout grew even uglier. Venezuelan officials tied to the Cartel of the Suns openly mocked Washington, hinting at alliances with with Russia and China. Analysts warned that if Moscow or Beijing started funneling weapons or intelligence to the cartels, the drug war could spiral into a proxy war, a global conflict hidden under the guise of narcotics enforcement. And what about the cartels themselves? They weren't cowed, they were emboldened. In Sinaloa, cartel members toasted to the New York Massacre and Narco ballads, vowing revenge for every soldier killed. In Michoacan, the Jalisco cartel tested homemade surface-to-air missiles, raising alarms that U.S. helicopters could soon be targeted. One chilling intercepted message, allegedly from a CJN commander, read, "If America wants war, then America will drown in war. We already own their cities." And disturbingly, the evidence from the Queen's safe house suggested he wasn't bluffing. That evidence, the files, hard drives, and lists, remains classified, but multiple leaks suggest it contained the names of bankers, local officials, even U.S. politicians suspected of being cartel assets. If true, it would mean the cartels weren't just fighting Washington, they had already infiltrated Washington. Think about the implications. Every raid, every military operation, every policy debate, potentially compromised by cartel money. No wonder insiders whispered that the army strike in New York was less about drugs and more about silencing a network of influence that had become too dangerous to ignore. And that explains why, despite the bloodbath, despite the backlash, Washington shows no signs of backing down. The escalation is already underway. Delta Force teams are reportedly embedded with Mexican special forces, conducting joint raids on cartel hideouts. U.S. Navy destroyers and stealth drones are patrolling the Gulf, hunting narco subs. And behind the scenes, the CIA is allegedly greenlighting covert operations aimed not just at seizing drugs, but at taking out cartel leadership entirely. The message? America isn't retreating. If anything, it's preparing for an even deadlier round. But here's the nightmare scenario. Every time Washington escalates, the cartels adapt. Every drone strike breeds new tactics. Every arrest creates new martyrs. Every massacre in New York becomes another propaganda victory for an enemy that thrives on violence. And as history shows, when wars become endless cycles of escalation, it's the civilians, the ordinary people, who bleed the most. So where does this end? Some say it ends with victory, the cartels crushed under the weight of U.S. military power. Others argue it ends with compromise, a dirty truce that acknowledges the cartels as de facto governments in Mexico. But the darkest possibility is the one no one wants to say out loud, that this war never ends, that the massacre in New York was just the first of many, that the cartels have already embedded themselves too deeply in America's bloodstream to ever be cut out. And if that's true, then the next massacre won't shock anyone. It'll just be accepted as the new normal. Here's the cold reality. The U.S. Army may have struck a cartel pipeline in New York, but in doing so, it exposed a truth more terrifying than any stash house or fentanyl bust. The cartels aren't just infiltrating America, they're already here, in the subways, in the schools, in the banks, in the neighborhoods where you live. And if the New York massacre proved anything, it's this: the war on cartels isn't coming to America, it's already here. By the time Washington declared the New York operation a success, the truth had already leaked. Success? Tell that to the families burying loved ones after crossfire turned neighborhoods into free fire zones. Tell that to the civilians who watched armored vehicles roll past their windows like they were living in Baghdad. And tell that to the soldiers whose bodies were flown home under flag-draped coffins. The army could spin the headlines, but the cartels had won the narrative war. Social media was flooded with videos painting the massacre as proof that America's military was unprepared for urban combat on its own soil. TikTok montages mocked U.S. troops as foreign invaders in New York. Telegram channels shared instructions on how to ambush convoys, recycling battlefield lessons from Syria and Iraq for use against soldiers patrolling Queens. The cartels didn't just survive the army strike, they weaponized it. And then came the counterstrike. It didn't happen in Mexico. It didn't even happen at the border. It happened in New York's financial heart, Wall Street. According to leaked FBI memos, cartel-linked hackers infiltrated a mid-level trading firm suspected of laundering narco money. Within hours, stock trades went haywire. Millions vanished, triggering ripple effects that spooked markets worldwide. To the public, it was reported as a cybersecurity incident. To insiders, it was something far worse: the first narco cyber attack on U.S. soil, retaliation for the massacre. And while Washington scrambled to contain the damage, cartel operatives unleashed their most brazen strike yet. A fentanyl stash, deliberately placed in a Manhattan public school's basement, was tipped off to authorities by an anonymous call. When hazmat teams stormed in, they found enough fentanyl to kill the entire student body 10 times over. The message couldn't have been clearer. You kill us in the streets, we'll remind you how easily we can kill your children. The political firestorm was immediate. President Trump's administration defended the strikes, citing national security and the terrorist designation of cartels. But opposition leaders blasted the White House, accusing it of turning New York into a battlefield without a plan for civilian safety. One senator snarled, "This isn't counterterrorism, this is reckless militarization. Meanwhile, Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum doubled down on her hugs, not bullets stance, publicly condemning U.S. military actions, even as her own army was dragged deeper into joint operations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. While Mexico claimed sovereignty, U.S. drones were already flying 600 miles into its territory hunting kingpins. Internationally, the fallout grew even uglier. Venezuelan officials tied to the Cartel of the Suns openly mocked Washington, hinting at alliances with Russia and China. Analysts warned that if Moscow or Beijing started funneling weapons or intelligence to the cartels, the drug war could spiral into a proxy war, a global conflict hidden under the guise of narcotics enforcement. And what about the cartels themselves? They weren't cowed, they were emboldened. In Sinaloa, cartel members toasted to the New York Massacre and Narco ballads, vowing revenge for every soldier killed. In Michoacan, the Jalisco cartel tested homemade surface-to-air missiles, raising alarms that U.S. helicopters could soon be targeted. One chilling intercepted message, allegedly from a CJN commander, read, "If America wants war, then America will drown in war. We already own their cities." And disturbingly, the evidence from the Queen's safe house suggested he wasn't bluffing. That evidence, the files, hard drives, and lists, remains classified. But multiple leaks suggest it contained the names of bankers, local officials, even U.S. politicians suspected of being cartel assets. If true, it would mean the cartels weren't just fighting Washington, they had already infiltrated Washington. Imagine what that means. Every vote in Congress, every city budget, every law enforcement raid, potentially tainted by cartel dollars. It explains the hesitancy, the political gridlock, and the sudden collapses of anti-cartel initiatives over the years. If even a fraction of those names on the list prove authentic, the U.S. isn't just at war with cartels abroad, it's at war with cartels inside its own government. That brings us to the end of this video. For more interesting videos like this, click on the cards on your screen.